Okay. Okay, this is a Plainfield Planning Commission meeting for Monday, June 16th. And we'll call the meeting to order. And the first item of business we usually do is approve the minutes. So can we have of the previous meeting, can we have a motion to approve?
Yeah, I'll make that motion.
And a second?
Second,
Okay, any discussion on the minutes? All those in favor?
yep.
I
Okay, the minutes are approved. The next item I have on the agenda is to review the proposed land use map that the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission sent out. And I sent that out. I'm going to screen share it. It's really hard to see what's going on. I don't know if it's worth screen sharing it. It'll look like a green blob with a lot of little orange blobs. Um, but the idea behind this, uh, um, uh, there's a bunch of ideas behind it, but one of them is to have the same set of criteria for all the growth zones in the towns, in the regions. Each region planning commission has its own map that it's coming up with, so it'll fill out the state. And it's kind of a rollout program. I think this one is due in October, so there'll be some public comment on it. But basically, what they did is they put the growth in the areas that had the sewage capacity, where there's wastewater capacity is the high growth. Areas around that are medium growth, and some towns, if you look at the map closely, they have what called proposed hamlets. Like East Montpelier has two, North Montpelier and the center. Calais has one. Um, Towns that are a little more don't have a town center already or having these hamlets. I don't think that's something we need to deal with right away. Where would we put a hamlet? I think we need to concentrate growth. The village is our ideal place to have that growth. So the Regional Planning Commission are going to send out dates that the staff will be on at the meeting. They'll describe the methodology, what it's for, how it'll work for the town. Um, and like we discussed at the last meeting, even our neighborhood development area application is going to be reviewed probably in early July by the Community Development Board. So it should be approved, but a lot of those um, advantages of the NDA will be afforded to the towns through this land use area map. However, if we have that designation ahead of time, we bump up that tier to the next level of advantages. And they'll do a better job of explaining it. But basically, even though sort of there will be neighborhood development areas from give, suggested by the Regional Planning Commission, the town of Plainfield is already ahead of the curve on that with this village center designation and neighborhood development area designation, and we automatically like jump up a layer on the ladder. So I'm not sure when that'll be. It'll probably be in the next couple of weeks. They want to have a joint hearing between the select board and the planning commission. And I don't know, Peter, if I suggested to Carl, I said, Carl, you could do this at one of your regular meetings rather than schedule a special one. Shouldn't take that long, but we'll see how that shakes out. So any questions on that? We'll get more details when we hear the um, the staff come along, and it's very much a work in progress.
Well, I had one question,
Yeah,
which it's not pressing,
yeah,
but it like a lot of the Plainfield is appears to be designated resource-based recreation.
yeah.
And
They'll
I
have to.
looked at what that I looked at what that was, and I just wasn't sure how it fit in or what they meant.
Yeah, I, I don't. They'll have to explain that.
Yeah.
I, yeah. What does that mean? a lot of it is conserved land. They may be describing the conserved area. Certainly the all that green area in the eastern part of town is L.R. Jones State Forest
Right.
and Bailey's property and some of its areas above 2,500 feet. So, and some of his connectivity, but how they determine those border lines, I'm not going to say yet.
Yeah.
They they may not have that answer yet.
Right. And what they mean by resource-based recreation, I looked it up. I saw their definition.
Yeah,
Nothing in Plainfield really fits it, but it may be a catch-all for not agricultural, not conserved, you know,
right.
not being used for any specific purpose or something like that. I don't know. I couldn't
Yeah,
figure it out.
once again, it's their puppy. I do understand the growth areas and how they determine that. I have a little bit of a handle on that, but how they break down the larger things and what they mean
Yeah.
are, yeah, because the thrust of the growth area is all about housing, and it's
Yeah.
all driven by the housing, and the rest of it is um, yeah, we'll have to wait and see. So that's that. The next item is the proposed subdivision regulation changes that I sent that sheet out with the really the primary one of the takeaways is the description of how Plainfield has the total time elapsed in a major subdivision in Plainfield if you work out all the warnings and all give it all the wait till the end of the warning periods is 7.5 months. In some of the other towns, it's like Montpelier's 3.5 months, Waterbury's 3 months, Calais is 3.5, and Hardwick is 3.5. And that's because we have two sets of hearings. And um, if we if you review the paper that Sandy put out, Sandy Bitsum, the gist of it is the Plainfield has um, a, a longer hearing process, and it also has the minor and the major. If we basically go to the minor subdivision guidelines and use that process for all subdivisions, you have all the same warning, the same criteria to put out notices to the neighboring properties. You do all the major steps. You just only do them once, and then we have a more complicated process to file the final plat. We also the language also confuses plans and plats. A plat is a legal document, a Mylar that gets filed to the town, where a plan is basically the sketch plan or the layout of the properties can be done as a plan. The plat is really the survey final product. So cleaning up that language would be an advantage to the town. It would make the work of the DRB easier, and it would make the application process easier. So I think we all need to read that a couple times and read the subdivision, um, the full document that we went through, and then really decide how to proceed. When we had our meeting with the DRB, we discussed this in broad outlines, and I sent the documents out. But I think it's up to the planning commission to really nail down the language and then put it through a hearing process and get I think the DRB, Jesse, you can uh, sort of chime in on this. Would be glad to have an easier process.
Yeah, that was when it came up in the conversation, and there was a lot of confusion about the purpose of the preliminary sketch plan versus the
Yes.
preliminary plat review.
Yep.
It almost felt like it was sort of a added for no clear purpose, and maybe to be helpful to people, not recognizing that the time spans allowed for it all stretched it out more than is necessary.
Yeah, yep, yep. Peter, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, hearing that Plainfield takes twice as long as much bigger municipalities makes me ask the question, why? Why are we set up like that?
I think the Sandy's take on it is that a lot of these early zoning documents were written by consultants or this at state level. And all these towns had this kind of our original document structure. And they all decided they didn't want it anymore. And I think it's time for us to jump on the bandwagon. Because she looked at older callous subdivision regulations, and the older ones had the minor and major distinction, and they got rid of the minor. And I talked to the Regional Planning Commission, and you know, I think we don't want to be slower than anybody else. You know, I think it's a disadvantage to the town. Certainly, it makes a bigger workload for the DRB, and it confuses people. If you confuse what a plat is with what a plan is, when there's a sort of an accepted terminology around that nomenclature, it just makes it more confusing. So
So it sounds like this is a vestige of an earlier time.
it is, and Plainfield hasn't had a lot of subdivisions. You know, they've you know, there are a lot of minor subdivisions that are 2 or 3 lots that go pretty easy because they're the simple process. But 4 lots or more, there just haven't been enough of them to deal with. Whereas some of the other towns, the more you utilize your bylaws, the more you realize that they're not the best, or that you can make them better. So that's where we are. I'd like you know, everybody to take, you know, look at it, and I'll send it out to the other DRB members, telling them that we're looking on it. This is what we're looking at, because they if they have suggestions, and they've been doing a bunch of bigger subdivisions, so they understand how that works. I think we'll be better off to have a more streamlined process.
Will the subdivision regulations, the major and the minor, are contained in the so that's where, I mean, because I wasn't at that last the meeting with the DRB. So and they're laid out like this. In other words, it like for me, I what I want to be able to look at is each category reasonable, and if it's not reasonable, what is reasonable? So in
Right.
other words, you know, like submit sketch plan 15 days before a meeting, is that a reasonable thing? Not, you know, at least for the way I think, that's the way I'd like to be able to review them and for each thing, and then see if it makes sense. If thinking, well, if I was on the DRB, how much time would I need to review these things to be sure? And I'm, you know, I could say I don't fully buy in that major and minor would necessarily be the same, because a major subdivision can be pretty darn complicated.
It is, but if you on the minor level, there's still enough time to do all that review.
Yeah, there may well be. I haven't reviewed them.
Yeah,
So.
and as you read through it, what I say, it's you want to be on both sides of the counter. You want to be the customer, and you want to be the guy selling.
Sure.
So, you know, if I'm going to do a 5-lot subdivision, does this seem reasonable? And if I'm on the DRB, do I have enough time and information to make a decision?
Yeah.
And I think, and I'll send you, I think I'll resend you, just so you have it out there if you don't have it on that computer. Yeah. The subdivision, I'll send you the current, what we have now, and then the suggested changes that we're making.
Okay. Yeah, that somehow I didn't.
Yeah, sure.
The thing from Sandy that you sent out doesn't have all that. It just has the comparison.
Yes, and
All
I
right.
thought I sent the document, but I'll resend it just so
Okay.
we have that. And
Okay.
and and as you read through it, be the customer and be the seller, be the
Yeah. Yeah.
salesman and be the customer.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it. And because I've been both,
Yeah.
and you
Sure.
have too,
Yeah.
or maybe you haven't been on the DRB or reviewed them, but you've been the customer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's sort of our next big project, to work on this and see how we can make it through. And then once we have all the language, we'll do the same process we did before where we'll come up with draft language, we'll warn a hearing, we'll, have the hearing, get discussions, and then make any changes, and then we'll send it to the select board. And they will do the same process, much like we're doing with the amendments now, with the select board having their hearing in July 14th. Okay, so that's where that is. It's going to take a little more digging in and looking and asking questions, but it's relatively a significant change. So we don't want to like just make it happen very quickly, or we don't want to neglect our review process of it. So the other item is we have been discussing tiny homes, RVs, and mobile home parks. And I have had a couple of conversations with regional planners and some local planners. And the the general view is don't define tiny homes. Don't define we define RVs, we define mobile homes, and a home is a home, whether it's big or small. We allow yurts. If you We even define mobile homes. We don't have specific language around mobile home parks, but we there is a statewide structure for that. So I think our zoning is okay for tiny homes. We say if they're attached or not attached. If we say if they're on a tray on wheels, and if they're a certain size, they're an RV. And the RVs are limited by time to 6 months. And mobile homes, you can't discriminate them against them. And they're either on a trailer but when a structure is attached to a pad and it's a home and it needs a wastewater permit, and that can be hooked up to the town wastewater system, or it can be an approved septic system. But if you call it, the one distinction is if you can take them up and move them. But if it's bolted to a pad, if it's secured to a pad, it's a home, the same as a Huntington home is. I mean, it's a pad. Sometimes it's a foundation, but we don't. It's like trying to get in to say what color we want to make the homes or what kind of roofs you want to put on the homes.
And that makes sense to me, the distinction between something that is on a foundation versus something that is on wheels.
Yeah, and we define that already in the zoning.
Right. And is there a clear distinction between an RV and a mobile home in terms of?
Yes, an RV. I'd have to go dig it up right now, but basically we say an RV. I think it's 400 square feet or less, measured on its widest bump out. So if it's bigger than that, it's a mobile home. If it's smaller than that, it's a recreational vehicle. And I don't know, I'm sure maybe they make RVs that are gigantic now, that maybe that definition may not be adequate anymore, but we do distinguish between a mobile home and a recreational vehicle. And we have limitations on recreational vehicles.
I guess my question is, could what we kind of like colloquially call a tiny home that's on wheels be under that size limit and become an RV?
Good question.
I mean,
If the tiny home was on a chassis, I think an RV is described as a chassis, and it was less than that 400 square feet, it would be an RV. It may look like a cute little home, but it would technically be an RV because it's so mobile and it can be transported easily.
Yeah.
So
Does an RV require an engine?
No, no, it can be a trailer.
Can be pulled by a
So
vehicle.
you're talking, it's a camper.
Yeah,
A camper
yeah,
trailer.
it can be a camper, it can have a motor, or you can tow it with a pickup.
And I think that's a really important clarifying point when these conversations about tiny homes come up. Is that
Yep,
that's above and beyond the distinctions that zoning is concerned with. What it looks like, what the materials are, how durable it
r-
is.
yeah, that's a good point. But if you want to have a distinction between an RV and a mobile home, and you build a, I mean, you've essentially built yourself an RV.
Yeah, if it's too small.
Yeah, right. If you could build a 400 square foot RV, but it has to be on a chassis. It can't be just can't be, it can't, if it's mobile, it's one thing, but if it's a chassis and roadworthy, then you've built yourself an RV. But it
Yeah,
would be easy enough to not build it on a chassis. You know, you're building it on a steel framework with wheels. That's not a tiny home. Tiny home is implies that it's a little more permanent than something on chassis with two wheels that you can tow, isn't it?
I
I,
I don't think that is true actually, Will.
I,
In the world of tiny home builders, I've seen many that are built on trailer frames so that they
yeah.
can be moved from place to place.
Oh, yeah.
My, my
Okay.
con my concern is that I get maybe similar to Jesse's, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of talk about tiny homes. And but tiny homes, what we've already heard is can be a lot of things. It
It
could
sure
be
can.
it can be a small house on a real foundation hooked up to sewer and water, and that's and be compliant with all codes and energy, current energy codes and all of that stuff. Or it could be tantamount to a mobile home, and there's no way to make a distinction it unless we do something. I agree with you, Will. We don't want to say, well, this is what a tiny home has to be, or this is, and get into regulations about tiny homes. But I think we may want to do something that defines what a tiny home is, so that if if the term is getting thrown around or is part of a permit application of some sort, that we have a place to put it. My other concern is that when we've talked about, the DRB had a preliminary application for a tiny home park,
A
and
resort.
yeah, and the concern I had about that was I don't think it would necessarily be looked at by the state as a mobile home park necessarily, especially if some of the tiny homes were smaller than, I think it's actually 420 square feet. Um, I might be wrong about that. And so then it's like, do, do we give easily approve a permit for what is essentially a mobile home park, but it's not regulated as a mobile home park? And then the people who are renting, do they have any protections at all? Um, some of it goes back to the early days of, when I was on the land trust board and we got involved in mobile home parks, and some of it was pretty tough. Some pretty ragged, rugged places and people without much resources. And I'd hate to see a situation where it's easy for somebody to kind of skirt the mobile home regulations, state regulations, not our regulations, by saying this is a tiny home, not a mobile home.
Yeah,
I
well,
don't know
I
how to
think,
deal with it, but
well, I think if the person owns the property and leases the pads and the utilities, that's the distinction right there. Not what you put on it,
yeah,
but the legal framework of the ownership. And it's all owned by the single owner, and he's renting space. So that's a whole different thing,
yeah,
which we
Well,
don't
the
regulate.
example here is a campground, which in the case of, I know Onion River Campground in Marshfield,
Mhm.
they're specifically not allowed to have people living in those structures for more than, I think it's 180 days out of the year.
Yeah.
And that's because it's presumed to be all RVs,
Mhm.
and so they're given this sort of designation. So it's not treated as a mobile home park, it's treated as a campground.
Which are, if they're RVs, that's how we regulate RVs, with a limit of occupancy. So I think, but I think your point of, if you build what is colloquially known as a tiny home, but it's on a chassis on wheels and can be towed. And we defined the size of that as an RV. At the moment, that couldn't be permanently occupied other than this at a 6 month area. I don't know how we could write a how we would try to figure out what is the RV parked on East Hill up from your house, that is not going to be, if it had cedar siding and a tiny home, could it be permanently occupied, assuming it has a wastewater permit?
right.
The
And
um,
where it gets, because you're just distinguishing sort of signifiers of status and saying that that now is in some other classification. And I think sticking to the size and the foundation are the two really critical things that seem like are generally addressed in zoning.
yeah, but we are. I mean, the East Village does have. There is people who want to build really small items, houses or yurts or dwelling units, small dwelling units, that uh, that are going to be permanently occupied.
Well,
And
this
if
is,
they're,
I was wondering about that, Will, when you're referencing yurts. I thought that there was some language around temporary structures
yeah,
that.
Karen's got a way to make the yurts work, because there are yurts in town.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess it needs more work. The point, we don't want to define a tiny home specifically, but we don't want to have a structure meant for permanent occupancy that meets our definitions of an RV have to not be occupied for more than 180 days before they move it. Because if someone's planning on putting one of these tiny homes that's on a chassis that can be moved, but they want to live in it for a couple of years while they do something else, or that's what they have to live with, how do we accommodate that? Because that's different from parking an RV in your backyard and turning it into an accessory dwelling. But maybe,
I don't know how different. I'm not sure that that really is that different.
it
If
may,
the,
may
if you're talking about East Village and, like a little hub of what's been labeled tiny houses. I think tiny houses is undefined by the people who are using that terminology. They're just kind of using common language, meaning, oh, this is a place where there'll be small places. But they're talking about selling lots, so it's not like you're coming and parking on a rented piece of land.
Right.
You own the land.
yes.
You're just putting a small / tiny home on it. I don't know whether it's on wheels or not on wheels makes a difference if you're the owner of the lot.
No, it shouldn't. But because if you build it smaller than the 400 square feet and it's on wheels, then it would meet our current definition of an RV. So then it would then we do have a problem with that because we're constricting somebody's ability to build a larger place for permanent housing by assuming it's an RV when
I mean,
it's not.
use the example of someone who buys a small lot and then they put an RV on it that they want to live in for a couple years while they save up resources, or that they just want to live in that.
Well, you're allowed to if you're there is an exception if you're building another property, you can live in an RV for like a year or so. There's an exemption for that versus an RV who's in the backyard. They're visiting for the summer and then the winter and then the summer and because we have now accessory. Here's just thinking out loud. We can't restrict accessory dwellings. We've defined accessory dwellings at up to 1,200 square feet. That means, what if they take their RV and say, "Hey, I'm hooking up to the house septic system. I have a wastewater permit. I'm an accessory dwelling." I think you got to say, yeah, don't you? I don't. I mean,
Definition of an RV. I mean, that's
yeah,
where I think being clear that all of these definitions are predicated on size and mobility.
yep,
If you don't define it as, according to those two things, then it gets vague.
yeah. They start to connect. We do say any RV has to have their tanks pumped out or be hooked up to have some kind of wastewater permit. One of the defining criteria for a house is that you have a state wastewater permit. And some towns I've heard, and I think I'm not sure which ones, that's their only criteria. If you can get a wastewater permit for whatever it is you're building, you're good to go.
Yeah.
Which says it could be small, could be on wheels, could be this, could be that, but if you have a wastewater capacity, go ahead. And we do have these things about RVs. We don't have anything about tiny homes, but we do have something about wastewater. If you're a temporary dwelling, you have to have your RV pumped, or your some kind of wastewater permit. So that's the one controlling factor the town has in its zoning.
Works really well. Look at Bean Road.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Well, I mean, that's the thing. You have these examples like the Bean Road, and well, that's more of an enforcement thing, isn't it? I mean, it's in violation. We have the code.
Yeah,
It's a
wastewater, they have the wastewater permit, they've pumped it out.
and but it's the continuous occupancy because
Correct.
yeah. So I mean, in that case, we have a ordinance that they're in violation of, and we just need to figure out a way to legitimately enforce it, which is not an easy thing to do when somebody's trying to live there. I don't know if we had better language in the zoning, if that would be an easier situation. So, um, well, I guess on this item we can say needs a little more research on how to deal that gray area between we'll call it the homemade RV. How do we how do we distinguish between an RV that's temporary dwelling 180 days and a tiny home built on chassis that's permanently occupancy? We don't have a way to distinguish that. If it's below 400 square feet on a chassis on wheels, we call that an RV.
Yeah.
Okay. Unresolved, but needs some more research. So that was all I had, other than the next meeting. Yeah, we meet the first and third Monday of every month. The next, there's 4 Mondays in July. So we wouldn't be meeting on the first and third. We got 2 Mondays that we don't meet, and then we meet on July 7th.
Yeah.
See, and I'm going to be on Maine July 7th, but I can certainly do the meeting. If David can do it from Minnesota, I can do it from Maine.
Yeah, I'm
Closer, and you'll still be in Minnesota.
we're not I'm not sure. Probably.
Okay.
It'll probably be the tail end of when we're
Yeah.
hearing
Well,
it.
if you're on the road trip, you'll have to get a Starlink.
Yeah, that's gonna happen.
Yeah. So we could warn a special meeting for the June 30th. We could, or we could just go with our regular first and third meeting. Usually, yeah, Karen's not here, but usually the July, people go away. It's close to the 4th. I'm open for doing the June 30th or just trying to do it on July 7th, whatever the group feels like.
I don't mind waiting personally.
Just do it on the July 7th.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Then we
fine
don't
with
have
me.
to. Yep.
Pressing business that's gonna.
Yep.
So-
Yeah. Well, our pressing business is spend a little more time reviewing the subdivision language, and we'll just stick with the July 7th, and I'll try to figure out what the heck went wrong with the Zoom invitation.
And I want to think more about this tiny home thing.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah. Sure.
not it because it's I think from this conversation it's tricky. It's
Yeah.
and I think we should be able to come up with something, but it's not something I can say right at this moment.
Well,
We're gonna have to think about it a little bit
Yeah, the
and
more you pin it down, there's so many options for what could be quote unquote a tiny home.
right.
And then where does it transition into these temporary units, which we do have language around. And then when is a tiny home an RV, and when is an RV, when could an RV be a tiny home?
Right.
In other words, you buy the property in the East Village and you buy a used RV and you park it there and you're going to keep it there for a couple of years. It's, by our definition, it's an RV. Now, I don't know, maybe you could do a conditional use. I don't know. We don't know because no one's done it, and if the East Village expansion project happens, somebody will probably try to find that boundary.
Eventually, if not immediately, eventually.
Yeah. And because we have a relatively generous example of size of an accessory dwelling, and you can't restrict accessory dwellings on a unit, you can we have to face up with that. But we're trying to make it so housing works and housing is affordable. So we got to be a little flexible without being exclusionary, without being we can't do that because we don't like the looks of it.
Right.
That's how. There's never been much of that in Plainfield, but that's a reasonable potential if we're not careful.
Throw out the concept of I have someone who I know someone who owns a tiny home. It's one on wheels, and she's taken it around to different places in Vermont and lived in different places for varied amount of time. I don't know how easy it is to take the wheels off, but I want to throw the concept out of is if you demobilize your tiny home and attach it, is there some way that could be? It doesn't mean that you can't unattach it at some point, put the wheels back on and leave. And I bring this up because we have up at our place, we put in a cottage that we bought from Jamaica Cottage Shop down in Londonderry. And they make everything from little hen houses and greenhouses to big homes. I mean, fully equipped, with kitchens and bathrooms and the whole thing, and all different sizes, but they have lots of small dwellings. And I was talking to Sandy Fitzhugh about this because, you know, for, you know, $100,000, you could have a small, fully equipped home. You know, easily, you know, buying this and they're, you know, 6-inch walls with, you know, tight as a drum insulation and stuff like this. It's not on a foundation. They came in with a trailer backed up and the remote controls with the wheels on this trailer. I mean, they sent it over, they tipped it up, they slid it down. We had to prepare a pad, you know, for it to sit on, and they leveled it and boom, it's done. Is it attached, quote unquote? No,
But it's not on wheels.
it's not on wheels.
There-
But, you know, what would it take for us to move it somewhere else? Not a whole lot.
But you, yeah, but you can, you know, they moved town halls and libraries all, you know, in Johnson. It was a lot of work, but
Yeah.
basically,
That's your movie.
yeah, I think the wheels is not a bad place to start, because if you have these tiny mobile structures, but you take the wheels off and they're sitting on the ground, they're essentially there. That may be a, you know, and it wouldn't be that difficult for someone who built one of these structures themselves with the intention of maybe moving it one day, but wants to stay there for a period of time, jack it up and pull the wheels off. Not a hard thing to do. Put it up on cinder blocks, but no wheels. The wheels may be the one way to solve the issue that we've worked ourselves into. Just food for thought,
Yeah.
because the technology is there. Certainly in mobile, you know, Huntington homes, you get the pieces, you put them together. I mean, well, in the early 1900s, Sears was building the kits. You could buy the house from Sears and put them together. I mean, that's going to come around. So I think we have to anticipate some pretty inventive technologies in the next couple of years. You know, that place in Londonderry is a perfect example. They build them right there. They can go on the interstate. They're not that big, but they're not an RV. One thing it's not an RV. And you take the wheels off, and it's not an RV. It's at that point, it's a manufactured home. And you don't have to bolt it. You can just slide it on a pad, and you don't even need to put it on a pad. You can put it on. Now, you wouldn't want to put it on gravel, but you could put it on blocks, depending on how strong the frame was. But a pad, if it's on a pad, that's pretty safe. But think of another way. Let's say it came with its own foundation, essentially a steel frame, and you slid that right to the ground, but you took the wheels off. So that, to my mind, seems to address some of those issues of the distinction between an RV and a tiny home.
Then you can jack up, you put it on some blocks and pop off the wheels and live in it.
Yeah, you could. I mean, but that would be at that point it wouldn't be as mobile. You can come up with scenarios that will always cover the boundaries, but if you did that, the only distinction would be it would be aluminum sided versus clapboard sided. It would look different, but it would essentially be the same thing. And we're defining the concept, not the appearance.
Right.
And it has to have a wastewater permit, which we already have.
Yeah.
Okay.
One more quick question, Will. What's the status of the proposed amendments that they've been forwarded on to the select board?
The select board set a hearing date of July 14th.
Okay.
It's one of their regular meetings. They'll hold the hearing. Hopefully everybody will say, this is great, let's do it. And the select board could then vote to approve it. And then they would be part of the bylaws.
Okay.
And then we'll get good at this because we'll keep doing it for a while, at least for the subdivision and there's one other item. I'll save it, but to, just a thought, we talked about slope restrictions.
Yeah.
The our zoning says you can't build on more than a 10% grade. And that's probably not a reasonable restriction compared to what you can really build on. And I'm gonna share this this screen. I'm going to share, which is this uh, drawing that Sandy Vitsom sent to me, which is basically a house on a 22% grade is a walkout basement. So somewhere between Montpelier allows up to 20%, normally between 20 and 30% with a licensed engineer doing the landscaping. So I don't know, David, if you put a property on a slope like that with a walkout basement.
I mean, I've dealt with this a couple of times. I've had to get conditional use
Yes.
in Marshfield twice, I think, and I think they're at 15%. But um, I, I mean, I'm a big fan of walkout basements. So, but this example is, I think, one of her versions of what she calls a tiny house.
Yes. Yeah. 20
Um,
feet.
and you know, um, I have no objection to it. I don't know if saying that 22% across the board, you know, it might depend a lot on other factors on the land and how the house is situated and, you know, what the soils are, all of that. I think 10% is very low. I mean, it's
Yes.
a very, really low threshold. I
In
agree with
Plainfield,
that.
yeah. The
Um,
farmer would call that his flattest field.
yeah. Um, and I know, I remember, um, I'm pretty sure how wide was the house? It might have been 28 feet. Um, I'd have to look back, but you know, it's certainly something worth talking about because 10% is pretty restrictive,
It is.
and
It
I'm a
is.
big believer in walkout houses as an affordable way to build and get more space for
Yep.
virtually nothing and all of that. It's tricky. It's very tricky when you borrow money from a bank uh, because most banks won't look at anything below grade as being finished space, no matter what you do. So
Mm.
that's a complication to a walkout and affordability, but it's another issue.
Right, right. Well, I'll send you Montpelier's slope restrictions, and they have tiers where up to 15 or 10 or 15, it's not a problem from
Yeah,
15 to 20, but they require a licensed engineer
yeah,
to evaluate the situation, which I'm
yeah,
perfectly happy with.
yeah. Me too. I don't. I have no trouble with
Yeah,
that.
and do you end it at 25 or 30%? And we can decide on that number, but 10 blanket 10%
Pretty tough.
it well, if you're trying to have more housing in a town like Plainfield with a lot of hills, it makes it really difficult.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Yeah, and you go to Montpelier and they have stuff on. They have some houses on really steep hills, but they're a lot of on bedrock, and so they're. I think we can do something with the slope restriction. How complicated we want at a certain tier. I think we should require an engineer.
yeah.
And do we go up to 25%, 30? We're just 30% is
It's get.
that's
I
yeah.
mean, to me, over 20% is starting to be pretty steep. But if there's a licensed engineer that approves it,
Right.
that's you can you can always find somebody to approve anything.
That's true.
But we can't address that either. So,
No, but we can cover it by saying licensed and licensed
it,
engineers approve
there's
this.
also the conditional use
Yeah,
tool, which could make sense. That's what we had in Marshfield. This was a while ago, but that's was just conditional use. I think I'm not sure. It might have been even 12% over 12%. I only
yeah,
know we had to do it at 15%, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
was unhappy.
Yeah, yeah. But I think liberalizing that a little bit is going to be good.
Yeah.
And 30 is too much, 20 is probably enough, 25 maybe a sweet spot. I don't know. But
Okay.
reviewing the Montpelier one because there's a lot of steep houses in Montpelier.
Yeah.
I'll send that out too. Okay. Oh, well, any other business?
I have a
Okay.
question.
Oh, yeah.
I thought you were going to talk about the NDA application tonight.
Oh, I could. I mean, I'm going to send you I'll send the select board a full copy. There were some minor adjustments to the map. And I wanted to wait till it was approved, and I thought the what is it, the Development Commission was going to review it in the first week of June, but they're not going to meet till July because they have to have enough of a quorum. There's a issue with our when we drew the neighborhood development area, the boundary, we assumed that if a property had access to wastewater pipes, say Goddard, it runs through the property, it runs to Northwood, that we could draw the boundary around the Goddard property. And like the East Village project, the wastewater pipes can go to the East Village, that whole property. So the property should be within the boundary. But our village district has has two densities. It has a density of 1/10 of an acre with conditional use, with sewage access or with access to sewer, and then 2 acres with no access to sewer access. So the state determined that in the town's wastewater policy is that if you're within 200 feet, you must hook up to the system. That's what the wastewater system says. The state assumed that therefore the only place you can have the prescribed high density, in other words, not the 2 acres without sewer in the village district, is only within that 200-foot buffer of the wastewater lines. So they determined that only like 2/3 of the village expansion property met that qualification. We just assumed that the property did because no one in their right mind would say, yeah, we had 8 acres here. But the other 2 acres, we'll just build a $50,000 septic system, and we don't want to join into the wastewater plant. I mean, no one would do that. But that's not, the state viewed it as minimum required density. So what we did was the wastewater, when the wastewater commission met with the village expansion property, they said, sure, we'll hook you up, no problem. What they didn't say is they agreed that would happen, but they didn't state it specifically in the minutes. So I asked Mary Lane to have a special meeting where they said, yes, when we had our meeting with the village expansion property proposal, we included the whole property. So I submitted those minutes with the application. Goddard couldn't do that. So at the moment, the NDA boundary includes a corridor of the wastewater system going to the library and Northwood. But that basically means the whole campus, other than is in the NDA. All their existing buildings are in the neighborhood development area, and that corridor is there. And the Jacob who is administering the program said. That's an easy way to change that. After you can do that after the final application, you can adjust Goddard property. But for the vast majority of the NDA property, it's in that 200-foot buffer, where the minimum density is guaranteed. And that led us to sort of another concept that we discussed at the last meeting, is maybe we should just make the whole village district the wastewater district, that 200-foot minimum, because that's essentially where the high density is. That's something we should look at. How do we resolve that problem of a village district with two different densities? Apparently, not many towns have that.
You'd have to do that with Marshfield, since a big chunk of the wastewater and water system is not in Plainfield.
Yeah, but that would be their zoning, not ours. We're just dealing about our village district ends at our town boundaries. And the wastewater commission would keep whatever their policy would still be in effect. It's just a way to how should Plainfield deal with its dual density within the village, our geographic village district, which maybe is bigger than it needs to be. That's a question that I think we'll discuss as we go along, or find another way to solve the issue of the double density. Jacob had some ideas. It sounded complicated. I like to make things simple, and just, if that's really where maybe there's a way to change the wastewater policy that maybe make that boundary longer. Maybe if you're 400 feet, you got to hook up. I mean, we want the customers.
Yeah, what it is like 200 feet, sort of the distance that the wastewater people would be willing to run the connecting line.
No, I think the customer runs the line, or maybe they reach some kind of agreement.
It
But
seems that you would limit the homeowner from running a 250-foot connecting line to their house, which is in the village, but it's 250 feet from the water main.
No, you could run. I mean, I could run if I wanted to. I could pay to hook up from my house here on the Brook Road if I wanted to spend $500,000 running a line.
What is it requiring?
Yes.
Anything
The 200-foot, you're required to hook up. They wouldn't mind at all if you were 400 feet away and hook up. But they haven't traditionally said that you must hook up at 400 feet. That's another way to solve that issue, because the capacity's there, the need to have the customer is there, and there's really not a lot of properties there's not a lot of new growth other than the village expansion that is on the periphery of that 200-foot buffer. It's been a question in 30 years.
Yeah.
And the NDA, I mean, this came up like 2 days before the final application, and we had to solve this issue. But I think it's solved. It's done. And ironically, it turns out the NDA will come along whether we do anything or not. We'll just get a little extra bonus at the back end. So, that's a conflict, a growth issue. And while we're just tossing out ideas, I met with Josh, the treasurer, today, because one of the planning commission's tasks is to also be involved with the town's capital budget. And Josh is working on he has a pretty good handle on a capital budget on the roads, replacement costs. But then what about long-term water infrastructure? That sort of ties into where the town wants to grow. And, what are the user fees? Do the user fees build up a fund so we can not only fix what breaks, but maybe expand the geographic area of the sewer district in 10 years. So the our legislative charter is also not only to come up with the bylaws for the town, but also to be involved with the capital planning, because the capital planning can direct where the growth is going to occur. So if we ask, where do we want the town to grow? We want it to grow near the village, but the wastewater capacity is only limited by a certain geographical area. If we build up, $100,000 extra, we can extend it further up East Hill, further up Berry Hill, more into Goddard, but those are just questions that the planning commission should be involved with versus a capital budget that doesn't have that longer range outlook. Which I reminded Josh, it's time to think about rewriting or updating the town plan. And I'm always, not only do I like to ask for members, I like to ask for people who want to contribute. And that's probably a next year project for the planning commission. But it is, if you read it, you read it and you think, well, that's not the town I live in. The town I live in has a college that's changed to private hands. It had the middle torn out by a flood, and it's trying to build new houses, and all this stuff is going on, but it's not in the town plan anymore because town plan's 5 years old.
Yeah.
So we have a lot to look forward to. Thanks for coming on, David.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
It gets real interesting after a while.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. So those are the items we'll be working for. I'll send out that information, and Peter, I'll send all the select board a copy of the. I've got it in one PDF that you can look at. And I think I'll just say it won't be till early July, mid-July that we'll know what the final result on that is. I'm thinking it'll be approved because the staff has said it's got all the necessary components.
By way of information sharing, the select board did receive an email communication from VTrans about the blinking light project on Route 2.
Oh, okay.
They're saying the big project cannot happen. Federal Highways is concerned about historical and utility concerns. There's that big pole that has a lot of Green Mountain power utility wise. I mean, they deal with this all the time, so I don't know. This is not new stuff since this particular intersection has been in the news. Bram Tobin sent out a press clipping the other day, a picture from the front page of the Times Argus from 1969 with the picture of the intersection saying Plainfield residents have been complaining for many years about this. So here we are, nothing has changed. And they said we have a small alternative version, which they tentatively presented to the select board a couple of meetings ago. So now they formally have put that on the table. Basically, the proposal is we might do some sidewalks and a crossing. We'll take down the guardrail. We're not going to lower Route 2, but we're going to put make it a green island there. And Josh had concerns about runoff and the lack of a guardrail with trucks missing the turn and ending up in his bedroom. And other than that, they wouldn't do any of these things for 4 years. So rather than a big project starting in 2 years, we have a small project that doesn't have anything happen for 4 years. And so we're now in the position of being asked for a formal response to that.
Can you give the middle finger as a response? Why can't they just put a stoplight there?
That's a great question. We asked that. Patty Gemelli and I and Josh met with the lady from VTrans for about an hour and a half. And, we said, we still haven't heard anything from you. She said, no, we're working on a letter, we'll get it to you. So now we've got that. And we said, when they were doing the pedestrian bridge stuff on the Main Street Bridge, I said, we had temporary signalization there, it worked fine. You know, why can't we do that? They did look at that back in 2019, 2020.
Yeah, yeah.
For some reason, chose not to do it because it's a freeway. But there's another interesting wrinkle here, which is that the old hardware store property actually goes out to the retaining wall. So the road in front of that building is actually not a town highway. It's people driving across private land. And I've talked to the landowner, and his attorney is researching that. Ryan Christensen told me this a while back, and Rich Christensen told me this back when I said, why don't you guys just close it off? Put up barriers and say no road, you know, and then what? And Josh pointed this out and says, you know, Route 2 is a Federal Highway Administration project. They're gonna pay for 100% of whatever that they do, unless we have to move our own water and sewer lines, which Plainfield agreed to. Federal Highways is also in charge of the Brook Road flood repairs, not FEMA, okay? Because the Brook Road is a federally designated connector between 302 and 2. All the people on federal highways that are working on the Brook Road is a different group that works on federal highways on Route 2. And yet that blinking light intersection is the connection between the two. So you'd think the two silos within federal highways would talk to each other, but not yet.
Yeah, I remember the discussion, you know, with when they presented the big project, and the traffic light, they had all these reasons, like it was a three-way and you could, the sight lines weren't good. But if you come in from the east, you can see the blinking yellow light. If you come in from the west, you can see the blinking yellow light. Easy to see.
There's also ways that they can alert people that there's going to be a stoplight. We just drove across Canada. There, actually, Upper Peninsula in Michigan, there's a number of places you're driving along and there's out of nowhere stoplights around a corner, but they warn you 3 times before you get there with both other lights and you know, the kind of strips that are on the road that to wake you up and that kind of thing. And I thought,
can't
geez,
believe it.
that would work in Plainfield.
Yeah.
Peter, I just wanted to say to Peter, I saw in the minutes of the select board meeting that you talked about, you know, Andy Perchlik and talking to having our legislators lobby for the town and all of that. And I'm very much in favor of not sweet talking them by any means, but I think sometimes we've kind of worked against our own interests by yelling at people, and at VTrans particularly going back years, and you know, working with people like Perchlik or maybe Mark Mahaly or whoever we can enlist to support us, to kind of try to go upstairs if we possibly can. I'm highly in favor of that, and
Well,
you know, yelling at some representative VTrans at the meeting. You know, I didn't say anything at the time, but you know, it's just, I think that's a tricky business and doesn't necessarily help our cause. I'm not speaking about you at all. I'm saying,
no, I know who you're speaking about, and I
yeah,
have concerns there.
yeah,
Andy, I had a long conversation with him, Andy Perchlik, because he's currently the chair of the Appropriations Committee, but he was the chair of the Transportation Committee. And he came to many of the public hearings here over the years to discuss this project. He's intimate with what's going on there. He's intimate with going on with federal funding and the status of the transportation fund in terms of the Vermont budget and stuff. And it's like, okay, we know this is a difficult intersection. But if we're talking about growth in Plainfield, we need more ways to get across the river than a bridge with foundations that are falling apart.
Yep.
You know, so and none of the obvious ways to go across are within the town of Plainfield, except if you go out across Littlewood Farm, which is now in the land trust, and you're in the flood zone anyway.
right.
You know, so I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah. Well, the more we can kind of lobby for ourselves in some kind of positive way, I think the better off we'll be. If there's any if there's any, maybe we can't do anything about it. It's a small town with not a lot of power, but I'm happy to talk to Mahali. He's a friend of mine. He's not on any of those committees, but
Here's
he's a reasonable guy.
here's some things that we mentioned to, Patty Coburn was the lady from V-Trans who came out. And then, mentioned this to Andy Pershuk, which is they're proposing to extend the sidewalk from the Main Street Bridge up across the parking lots to a crosswalk over to the town hall. That would be great. And it's a crosswalk that's closer to the Opera House than the one in the big project. The one in the big project crossed at the Plainfield Inn, sort of where the concrete stairs are now on that island. So this would move it up further. There is no landing pad for a crosswalk on the parking lot side. That's not a big deal. And we're saying, why wait 4 years for that? There is a lot of new traffic going into the Town Hall Opera House. There's lots more events going on there, lots more meetings, a lot of kids stuff going on there. It's a big safety issue. And you have the yellow pedestrian crosswalk signs now that have the electric lights on, which give flashing, and you're seeing those being replaced all around the state. So if we had that there, we have an existing crosswalk at the post office, just that the lines have been worn away. And, she said, oh, that's a district, you got to talk to your district highway garage. It's like, put this stuff in and maintain it, And if we had one at the library, I think if we had those 3 things done and they looked at signalization as opposed to construction, I think we'd have our legislative delegation behind us and could push V-Trans to negotiate doing something other than nothing for the next 4 years, so. And I sent a long message to that regard off to the other select board members today, because I'm out of town all next week, so I'm not at that meeting, so.
Yeah, I can't see why the signal wouldn't work. I'm sure there's some federal regulations about this, that, and the other, but I mean, the alternatives just don't make any sense in terms of when they're going to get done and if they'll ever get done.
Yeah.
And it worked. It worked fine. And you only need to signal people going west. You don't need to signal people going east. If you can get the right of way past the old Hardware store.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could also have a sit-in, so,
Yeah.
just to draw some attention.
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks for showing up, Peter. It's good to have the communication with the select board.
Well, it's nice, we've had so many emergency meetings with the budgets and stuff like that, where like you guys were meeting the same night and it just was not an opportunity to do that. And then I know you guys had the NDA stuff and the amendments, here to talk about, so.
Yeah, we're just getting our heads above water to see what's next. Looking out the periscope.
Well, I am waiting, the town is waiting for more word on these FEMA buyouts. We've been stuck at 10 for a couple of months now. And I know the 2023 buyouts, they did get their appraisals done, but I don't think any of the 2024s have had their appraisal done yet. It's just going to be quite a while. And to have these derelict, unsafe buildings with little kids running around that we're not allowed to touch, and that anybody driving through says, "Ooh, what happened to this place?" Is just really not good.
No, it's not. It's not good. But FEMA's isn't known for speed. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for taking the time.
Yep.
And I'll send out some minutes, and we'll keep moving along. A motion to adjourn, to be formal about it.
Yep.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. See ya.
Bye.